Hi, I'm Bruce Walton from Road Safety Analysis, and this is the third in a series of 10 bite-sized demonstrations of my favourite things which MAST can do. In this clip, I'm going to go through an example of using the Casualty Mosaic profile to study the socio-demographic background of people injured in crashes. Now, as you probably know, there is a template report that exists automatically on the Casualties tab of everybody's MAST account, which is an example of a Casualty Mosaic profile. It's that one here. If I click on it, this sort of view will be familiar to many of you. But I want to go through the stages of how I went about creating this report in MAST so that you can find out a few things about how Mosaic profiles work. I'm just going to go back to the Select Report screen, and I'm going to start with a Casualties blank report to show how in a few simple steps I can build up a Mosaic profile from scratch. First of all, I'm going to switch to chart view because the indexes in a Mosaic profile only appear in chart view and also in Excel downloads. They don't yet display in grid view. And I'll show you how you can make any casualty report display indexing bars. The first thing you have to do is have the Mosaic dimension on the rows category tab down at the bottom here. So I'm just going to remove crash date and I'm going to put in Casualty Mosaic instead. I'm doing this with casualties, but exactly the same thing works if you do it in the Vehicles tab and use the Driver Mosaic dimension. I'm going to add that, and you can see all casualties divided out by the Mosaic group of their home postcode along the bottom axis there. The Mosaic groups A to K, each one has their own description. Group D, for example, there, if I hover over it, it tells you what Group D is. Group Z represents those casualties, about 20% of the total, for which postcodes were not reported in the Stats 19 data. I'm just going to filter those out, since for the purposes of Mosaic profiling, casualties for whom postcodes were not reported are not much use. So I'll just click on the filter button at the end of my Casualty Mosaic dimension and turn those Zs off. So now I'm looking at all casualties with a known postcode. You'll see that the indexing bars haven't appeared yet because I've got one more step that I need to do to turn this report into an indexed report. Any indexed report must have on the Filter tab down at the bottom here, it must have a home dimension, and that is because indices compare the number of casualties in this case, or the number of drivers if we were looking in a vehicle report, against the number in the underlying population. And in order to do that, it has to know what the underlying population is. So when I choose the Casualty Home dimension and add it onto the Filter tab, immediately I do that, index bars appear. And what that is telling me is that there were 222,000 or so casualties who were known to come from a Group D Mosaic community, and that group has an index of 114. In other words, it's about 14% overrepresented compared to the total population of Group D communities across the nation as a whole. If I wanted to see that for only one particular area, say that, for example, I was interested in the northeast region of England, I could simply filter the home dimension. I'll click on the filter there and drill down so that I can see the northwest region of England. As soon as I select it and click on OK, both the casualty figures and the index figures are recalculated to be based on the region that I selected. So that's the basic idea of creating an indexed report. But there's one other thing that I'd like to explain in this bite size. When I create a new indexed report, as I've just done, it's automatically based on the population of the home area. You can see it says index type population selected up at the top right hand corner there. But that's not always the most appropriate thing. If I was principally interested in pedestrian casualties, and to show you how to do that, I'm just going to add the casualty class dimension onto the Filter tab, which of course describes how a casualty came to be involved in a crash. If I filter that to pedestrian, Now I'm looking at pedestrian casualties relative to underlying population, which is the most relevant way of looking at pedestrian casualties, and you can see that groups F and G, even though they're not numerically the largest number of pedestrian casualties, are very much overrepresented by comparison with the underlying population. In comparison though, if I was looking at vehicle user casualties, I'm just going to change my filter on the casualty class dimension, turn pedestrians off and turn in-vehicle casualties on to give me vehicle users, you can see that the profile of vehicle users is very different. Now, in part, this may be because different types of communities tend to use vehicle transport more or less often compared to other groups. And in order to help you identify the effects of that, MAST supplies a second index base, the average annual mileage index base. You can see it referred to up at the top there. What that does is converts the index so that it doesn't show over or under representation compared to the population of the home area. It shows over or under representation compared to the average annual mileage travelled by people living in the home area. In other words, it differentiates between the frequency of vehicle use amongst different types of community. If I change the index base in this report from average annual mileage, I'm now looking at the index of vehicle users compared to how often different communities typically use their vehicles. And we can see that that's had a significant effect on the profile of Northwest vehicle user casualties. I'm going to finish off by saving my work, always a good idea of course. I'll call this Northwest vehicle users. There we are. And now that that report has been saved, I can go back and look at it at any time in the future. And that gives you some idea of how easy it is to create an indexed report in MAST and to change it so that it refers specifically to the type of road risk that you want to analyse. In the next bite-sized clip, I'm going to look at another of my favourite things that MAST can do. I'll demonstrate the use of the most similar authorities feature.